Saa tehdä mitä vaan. No ei saa tehdä mitä vaan.
Live päällä.
So, hello everybody who's present or absent in whatever mode you are. I was asked here to talk about the interconnections about population growth, poverty, hunger and environmental degradation. But I was also asked to open with a few remarks about myself. So my academic background is in philosophy and environmental policy. I was studying and working here for over 10 years in the University of Tampere. But since then I have been a science journalist, a science author, and currently I am working in an interdisciplinary research unit called BIOS. And I originally came to these issues which I'm talking about today through my environmental activism in the 90s mostly. I was working in many organizations that dealt with environmental issues, human rights issues, animal rights issues, peace issues, developmental problems, and so on. So my academic studies and my activism have been intertwined for many years. And recently, our research unit BIOS did a very extensive collaboration with the Finnish public broadcasting system, or Yleisradio. We produced a long-lasting complement of both dramatic content, radio plays, and interviews and news pieces that each dealt with climate change and other environmental issues and focusing on how they affect the everyday life of humans in Finland in the coming decades. So we had radio discussions about, for example, traffic or food production or economy or work, and each of these themes had a short audio-visual presentation, a short radio play, or actually two radio plays, and then we had interviews of experts and so on. So our work at the BIOS, in addition to regular academic studies, is heavily invested in public outreach to wider audiences, to politicians, to officials, and so on. And the theme that I'm speaking about today has been an important focus for me for a couple of years now. And for those who can read Finnish, there are a couple of pieces, a couple of essays I have written about population growth and about hunger issues, both in the BIOS website and in my personal website. So you can dwell deeper on these issues if they happen to engage you. So let's begin with the main content of the lecture. There's the clock. So
It's not.
it's not functioning.
1:20.
Yeah. So I'm gonna be speaking about, say, 40 minutes until 2 o'clock, and then we have about half an hour for discussion. That was about the size of it. I may speak a little bit longer, but about 1 hour of lecture, about half an hour of discussion. So I open with a theme that I'd like to call the lure or the illusion of global aggregate figures. So when issues like population growth, hunger, and poverty are being discussed, especially in the public, but also in the scientific circles, again and again they are condensed into certain global aggregates. For example, the total population of the world, or the total amount of food calories produced in the world, and so on. And focusing on these large-scale figures tends also to feed fatalistic viewpoints on the possibilities of better development, especially about population growth. If you look at the current projections of the UN population division, they seem on the surface rather grim. Their median level projection, they have a higher level and lower level projection, but the median level is often seen as the most likely one, is that as the population right now in the world is circa 7.6 billion, then in 2050 it will reach 9.7 billion, and in 2100 it'll be circa 11 billion. So this is the aggregate global figure about population that is repeated over and over again in discussion, and the whole issue of population is framed in the discussion in the light of this projection. Similarly, when food and hunger issues are being discussed, the most repeated figure is by FAO, which is the UN Food and Agricultural Organization, and they have said that in the coming decades, for example, until 2050, which is often a reference here, the global food production should increase by 50% in order to feed the growing population and the growing population of the world that is also becoming increasingly middle class. So the general situation of the world is painted often in view of these grand figures. More people, more middle class urban people, we need more food. But on the other hand, there are also severe problems regarding food production, especially the issue of climate change. And again, regarding climate change, certain global aggregate figures are repeated in public discussion. The estimates about how much climate change will damage food production in the world, they differ because it's very, very hard to make those estimates. But for example, the World Bank has estimated that climate change can drop world's food production by 20 to 25%. So on the one hand, you had FAO saying that we need 50% more, and you have World Bank saying that we're going to have 20 to 25% less. As a shorthand, the main issues with climate change regarding food production are problems with water and rainfall especially, and increased evaporation of water in warmer climates, more and new kinds of pests and diseases of crops, and so on. But let's not go deeply into that. I can talk about it more in the discussion if you wish. But the main question is, if we have this increased demand, increased need of food, and we have these prognoses of lessening food production, so do we inevitably have a disaster on our hands? And the main answer of my lecture is no. But understanding that no needs a change of perspective. It needs another kind of perspective from these grand scale global figures. And that'll be the main thing that I'll walk you through during this lecture. In global food policy and even in global food research, there has often been, for a long time, been what some researchers call a productionist focus. Well, the term itself is not so important. But the main idea is that hunger is being seen as resulting from lack of food. Therefore, you need to produce more food in order to eliminate hunger. This has been the focus of food policies, developmental policies. So it's been seen that increasing food production is the only way to catch up with population growth, to catch up with urbanization, to catch up with increasing middle class lifestyles, and so on. And the problem with here is that this is based on assumptions that current style of development of the world is inevitable. Especially regarding population growth, the UN productions that I referred to earlier, they are basically built upon the assumption that a vast number of, for example, women in the world will remain powerless or will remain uneducated. They are assumptions based that current trends of population growth will continue, and those population trends are built on poverty, hunger, the lack of power of women, and many other issues. And also, if certain things like population growth or the need of food are seen as inevitable and law-like assumptions, then it is very hard to see how things like hunger or poverty and population growth actually affect each other. So, for example, lessening of hunger and lessening of poverty can actually lessen population growth. So these different things are not independent, but they are in a sort of systematic interconnection to each other. And it's very hard to see those connections if you build your outlook on these sort of law-like predictions of the future. So let's look at it a little bit closer about these different issues: population, poverty, and hunger. Let's start from population. The fact that the world population has grown during the last quarter of a century, or but of course a longer time, but it has grown substantially during the last decades, is a brute fact. It is clear that in the recent 25 years there has been circa 2 billion more people coming to this world. And demography, the science that studies population, states that there is a sort of a mathematical inevitability that if a population has been growing for a while, then it will inevitably grow in the future, but the speed and the amount of population growth is not inevitable. And we shall go more deeper into that. But if you look at the UN population prediction, the 9.7 billion to 11 billion, that seems like that there is a sort of a population explosion going on. But actually, if you look at the issue from a different angle, there is not a population explosion. Because in many areas of the world, for example Finland, and actually all of the Europe, but also many Asian countries, there's what demographers call a population peak has already been reached. And in many areas of the world, like in Finland, the rate of births is actually going down very fast, and in nearly all areas of the world, the rate of birth is going down. So we have to look a bit closer to what is happening. In countries like Sweden or Finland, the population history has been basically like this. There was the first period when the number of births and the number of deaths were fairly equal due to, for example, high level of child mortality and so on. And then the second phase is with increasing hygiene, with increasing medical care, with better food and so on, the number of deaths would go down, but the old cultural habits would, regarding, for example, the number of children, the woman's rights and so on, they were still alive. So the number of births versus the number of deaths resulted in rapid population growth. But then with social changes like education, women's rights, democracy, and so on, births and deaths again started to meet each other, and happened was called a demographic transition from increasing population to stabilizing population. And this is where most of the wealthy countries in the world are right now, and actually Finland seems to be coming to the fourth phase, the phase of lessening population. So the number of deaths is actually larger than the number of births. This development took circa 100 years in countries like Sweden, for example. This research was first done actually in Sweden. In the 60s and in the 70s, when the concept of population growth was introduced, the fear was that if this process would take this long in all parts of the world, then the world population would reach 20 billion or 15 billion or 25 billion. And that seemed like to be an uncontrollable population explosion. But in the 80s and in the 90s, it was noticed that in East Asian countries, even countries like Bangladesh, which is in our public imagination often is seen as a country of, uncontrolled population explosion, this transition took much less time. It took 20 years or 30 years. So the rapid growth of world population stopped, or seemed to be stopping. The issue here is that when the number of births will reach so-called replacement level, which, depending a little bit on the context, is circa 2 children per mother. And in Bangladesh, for example, the last time I checked, it's 2.8. So it's actually very, very close to the replacement level. But due to what is called demographical inertia, if there has been a period of rapid growth, that means that the proportion of younger people in the population is larger. So even if you get to the replacement level, you will have population growth for a while until it stabilizes. So in a sense, this is actually another phase in the transition when the old inertia sort of dies off, and then you come to the stabilization phase. Well, a few years ago, the UN Population Division alerted the world that this rapid demographical transition was not happening in the same way as quickly in all parts of the world as it did in China or in some countries of the Far East. For example, India didn't follow this trend so quickly, and in many African countries, the transition seemed to be stopping or stalling. So again, the notion of population explosion came to the public discussion. But the issue here is that it is not a global population explosion. It's a situation where some parts of the world reach this population stabilization quite quickly, and others seems to lag behind. Then you have to look at the reasons why this is happening differently in different countries. And then you go to the interconnections with poverty, with hunger, and other social issues. So let's look at poverty next. Well, especially after the Millennium Development Goals, which was a project or a policy round developed by United Nations, where countries together devised developmental goals for the next 20 years. They were made in the 90s, and 2010 was the end year of the MDG or Millennium Development Goals round. It was touted very optimistically that poverty seemed to be going down rapidly around the world. And if you measure poverty, or if you measure wealth or affluence by the number of dollars per day, or euros per day, or whatever currency per day, this seemed to be happening. But the problem again here is with the aggregate figures that are applied indiscriminately in any kind of context. If you think of Finland, for example, well, you can measure the income of all the people, and it's fairly applicable to all Finnish people as a measure of their wealth, because everybody has access to the same kind of social security net, for example, the same kind of education, and so on. But for example, comparing the income of a Finnish person or a United States person is very, very hard, because in the United States you have to use a lot of your income for social security, for example, or medical security, and so on. This is, of course, the measuring is even more meaningless if you measure it to countries where social security is non-existent. And on the other hand, the income comparisons cannot measure the invisible social compacts that people have with each other, social aid done in communities, and so on. But even if we look at the brute measure of dollars per day, the current poverty line in the world is 1.9 dollars per day. So if a person earns more than 1.9 dollars per day, he or she is no longer technically poor. Well, of course, if people had only the 1.9 dollars per day, they would die, because there's the huge number of sort of invisible income which deals with their community aid, with their own subsistence farming, and so on. But it is quite obvious that this is a very, very low measure that doesn't really measure poverty in any meaningful way. But in addition to that, when people are going over the poverty line, the question is, how high are they actually going? And a recurrent problem in development issues is that when people bunch up just over the poverty line, so they maybe earn $2 per day, or $3 per day, or $4 per day, if they do not have any kind of a social security net, if they don't, for example, have access to banking accounts, which is actually the situation of the most people of the world, that they cannot save money, even if they basically have enough money to save. If people don't have insurances, they are very vulnerable. So slipping again under the poverty line into extreme poverty is very easy for these people. So measuring the true progress against poverty just by using the income measure is very unsatisfactory. And a similar problem is with measuring hunger. Hunger or undernourishment in the global statistics is usually measured by calories per day. How much energy does one get from the food one gets each day. And until last year, the number of undernourished or hungry people in the world using this measure was going down steadily, and it was around 780 million. Last year this number was going up after many decades. It may be to do with several recurrent and concurrent conflicts around the world. But by using this measure, 1/9 of people in the world are hungry, and this number has been going down. But if we look at hunger in a more extended sense, as an issue of nutrients, then the number of hungry people or malnourished people or undernourished people is much, much higher. It's 2 to 3 billion. So it's a third or nearly half, well, let's say a third of world population as opposed to 1/9. So the way we measure things can change our worldview quite radically. It's very hard to measure undernourishment by looking at nutrients, but often it's being measured by what's called proxies, other things that reveal systematic malnourishment. For example, child stunting, when children don't develop properly during their first years. And globally, one fourth of all children suffer from stunting. And also, calories per day is an inadequate measure of hunger and problems with food, because in addition to underweight, severely underweight people, there is also a growing problem with seriously overweight people. And often malnourishment and obesity, serious overweight, they are actually happening at the same time. So many poor people in the world have access to very energy-rich food that is cheap, but it is severely lacking in nutrients. I was actually quite horrified when a Finnish scientist, who is, well, he's an astronomer or cosmologist who likes to be the expert in all things. Well, the Finnish audience knows him. He said in an interview that hunger is not the big problem because there are more overweight people in the world than there are hungry people. And he simply didn't understand that actually these two groups can be the same groups. And I also ran into it when I was discussing an article by the United States version of the Guardian newspaper, an excellent article about poverty and hunger in the United States. And the frontispiece was a picture about a woman, a very sort of brave woman, locking her arms like this, staring angrily at the camera, and she was quite heavy set. And the first comment I got from a colleague was, well, she can't be hungry, she's overweight. So this problem of looking at hunger as only an issue of lack of calories, as thin people with pot bellies, as the sort of archetypal image of a differently colored child with an empty rice bowl, this is not a sufficient view on hunger. And also, one problem with the claim that hunger is diminishing as a problem is the food crisis. Which is meaning situations where there are severe problems with delivery of food or trade of food or fluctuations in the price of food. These are increasing in intensity. And this was a warning sign put out by the FAO at the same time when they were celebrating this achievement. They say that the food crises are increasing. So the poor and the hungry people in the world are becoming more vulnerable to sudden changes in their life situations, even though in general measure the number of poverty and the number of hunger seems to be going down. And this is a severe problem in devising sensible food policies, because just like in combating poverty, if you measure poverty by dollars per day, then the answer is, okay, you need more GDP. You need more economical activity, so wealth will trickle down to the poor people and people get more dollars per day. So you don't have to look at the issue of social security nets or medical insurances, class conflicts in countries and so on. And the same way, if you look at hunger as a calorie issue, you get sort of calorie policies that you try to eliminate hunger, for example, by importing cheap food in a country. And this has been done by countries, for example, like Ghana or Nigeria in Africa. And if you look at the statistics, these countries have managed to radically eliminate the number of the percentage of hungry people in their countries. But only if you look at the calories per day measure. If you look at malnourishment, it hasn't been going down in the same way. And at the same time, the cheap importation of goods has been quite harmful to the local production of food. And why this reliance on imports and reliance on imported energy-rich cheap food is a problem, then we need to take a different kind of viewpoint on this whole nexus of population, poverty and food, which has many different names, this different approach in different fields of study, but one which is often used, for example, in developmental literature is food security. The basic notion with the concept of food security is that hunger is not always an issue of lack of food. You can have severe hunger even if you have enough food present in a country or an area. And producing more food in itself will not eliminate food in the world, because food, of course, doesn't magically transport itself to faraway parts of the world. So if the farmers in the United States or Poland or Finland manage to put up their production by, say, 20%, that will in no way alleviate the life situations of farmers, say, in Ghana or in India, if they don't at the same time get, for example, increased possibilities of purchasing food. So food security is often addressed as a question of 4 pillars. That the first of them, availability, that is one part of the equation, which is the thing that is most associated with the discussion around hunger and food production. Is food available? Is the right kind of food available at the right place at the right time? That is one necessary requirement for food security. But the second pillar is often neglected, which is access. Do people have access to food? For example, do people have the money to purchase food? Do they have the logistical infrastructure to transport food to markets where people can purchase food, and so on. And the question of access is extremely important because a huge percentage of the poor and hungry people of the world are farmers. So people who produce food in the world very often go hungry. So even though you seem to have available food, and even if you seem to have access to food because you are producing it, you can go hungry because if you don't, for example, get enough income from selling your own crop, you are growing, say, maize or you are growing wheat, then you cannot purchase food oils, you cannot purchase protein, you cannot purchase fertilizers and so on. So access is of course faithfully linked to the issue of poverty. And the third pillar is called utilization, which means do people have the other resources at hand to be able to utilize the food that they have properly? For example, do they have the energy to cook their food? Do they have pure water and other hygienic facilities to produce food in a safe manner? Or does production of food, for example, foster diseases or other developmental problems? And this is again quite closely linked to the issue of poverty, because if children during their first 1,000 days of their lives don't get enough food, enough proteins, but enough proteins and energy, but also enough what's called micronutrients like vitamins and minerals and so on, they will never grow healthy enough to utilize the nutrients of food in their later life. So if you suffer from severe hunger during your 1,000 years of your 1,000 days of your life, then hunger and poverty are becoming over-generational issues. If you grow hungry, if you grow poor, your children are biologically more likely to also to become poor and hungry, because poverty and hunger sort of go down to a deeper biological level. They go as part of your brain structure, as part of your system of resisting diseases, and even to the level of being able to utilize your food. But even if all these three pillars are in order or are in good situation, the fourth pillar is especially important regarding the food crisis, is whether you have stability. Do you have availability, access, and capability of utilizing food all around the year? Are you vulnerable to food crises? Do you have steady income, or are you constantly in danger of losing your job, and so on? And I was referring earlier to the way that hunger is being combated by sort of increasing the production and increasing the importation of energy-rich, cheap food. And that tends to create the kind of vicious circles that were mentioned in the name or the title of this presentation. So when a poorer country becomes more dependent on imported food, the local production tends to suffer because it has to compete by centrally intensively produced imported food, which will erode especially local small-scale farmers who tend to have to move to the cities, and in the cities hunger is again perpetuated, because if there's not enough employment, even if you have the imported food, you will not gain the access to food, you will not gain enough income to purchase food, and so on. And the critique by people who are focusing on food security or food sovereignty perspective is that the current food system and the current way of combating poverty and the current way of combating hunger tends to perpetuate these kinds of vicious circles. So even though if you're looking at the grand scale statistics, the number of chronically underfed people, the number of extremely poor people, things seem to be getting better. Actually, you are still perpetuating this systemic destruction of countrysides around the world. So if you have these kinds of self-perpetuating vicious circles, would there be a possibility of creating virtuous circles where combating poverty helps you to combat hunger and so on? Well, there's one sign of hope that even in FAO, it seems that in recent years there has been a growing emphasis on small-scale farmers, family farmers or other small-scale producers, and small-scale fishers, and so on. Well, looking at the issue from a Western or industrial, well-to-do, wealthy viewpoint, that seems sort of counterintuitive. If we need more food, don't we need more intensive large-scale production, because that is more efficient, you get more bang for your buck, so to speak. But actually, if you look at the amount of food produced in the world, small-scale farmers in the world produce most of the food. And when you are strapped for cash, when you don't have capital for investing heavily in machinery or in fertilizers and so on, small-scale farmers are even more efficient. So small-scale can actually, even from the very narrow viewpoint of efficiency, can even be better. But if we look at the issue on the more wider social angle of food security, small-scale farmers, even though they don't contribute to GDP so fast, they create sort of radiating effects, or if you want another metaphor, they create like ripples in a pond where you throw a stone in. If a small-scale farmer, family for example, has access to markets and can sell their produce to the markets, then you get employment for people who are transporting the food, you get employment for people who are preparing the food, and so on. And especially in those sectors of the distributed food system, you will get more employment for women. It's quite hard for women to get proper income, for example, in the farm itself, because often the social codes are preventing the women from having a say or having power about, for example, how to take control of the income of the family and where we should invest our money or so on. But if women can also work in the wider sectors of the society, they have more chances of raising their voice. Well, the employment of women and the increased income of women means that the families in total get more income. It's easier to combat poverty. It's easier to combat hunger. You will also get a more reliable source of food for the whole local food system. But that the issue of how this links to the rights of women links it again to the question of population. Because it has been demonstrated over and over and over and over again in demographical studies that the only durable, sustainable way of combating quick population growth to get the population curve to the stabilization point is to empower women. Because empowered women have more control over their bodies, they have a say, for example, in the number of children being born in the family, and especially the intensity of birth or the frequency of birth. Shall we have 5 years before the next child, or shall we have 1 year? How young a girl or a woman has to be when she gives birth for the first time, 12 years or 20 years. Those issues are inextricably linked to the issues of women's rights, to the democratic institutions of society, and so on. But there is no silver bullet to the issue of population. Silver bullet is the metaphor that you can kill a werewolf by shooting with a silver bullet. This issue is not a monster, it can't be killed by a silver bullet. You need an ensemble of measures that support each other. Again, you have the notion of virtuous circles. So you need women's rights. But in order for people to effectively take control of their lives, they also need education. Especially for children, but also for adults who have been lacking education, the ability to count, the ability to write, and the ability to read. They are not sufficient, but they are the founding stone on the way that you can start to really take control of your life. And actually, educated people are even biologically different. Learning skills in a controlled way changes the nature of our brain. This is actually, regarding the population growth, there is a secondary paradigm of predictions regarding the population, the future population. One of them is the UN population growth, population division, which said that we're going to have 11 billion people. But another paradigm states that if the possibilities of education are truly realized around the world, then we can reach the maximum population of 9 billion. That would really require a coordinated effort of sustainable democratic development in the currently poor countries. That is basically an achievable goal versus having 11 billion people, a continuing population growth, continuing problem with women's rights and problem with democratic institutions. So you need education, but you cannot go to school properly if your family doesn't have income. And you cannot learn properly if you don't have food security, if you don't have all around nutritious food, not only energy, but other nutrients in order to develop properly, even down to your brains. And again, if we look at the pillars of food production, the fourth pillar was stability. And that approach goes here also. You can try to develop the society in all these different fields, but if you don't have an ability to make a coordinated effort, these things tend to become very vulnerable. Well, Afghanistan is a good example of that. The society was actually progressing quite highly regarding women's rights, for example, many decades ago, and then snap, the country changed on a different tack. Similar thing has happened in Iraq, for example. The country is very rapidly going on a downward path regarding education and women's rights. So you need stability. And this ties this whole issue to the question of wider policy. That developmental aid, for example, shouldn't be only an issue about getting food to people or getting daily income to people. It should be about mutual political cooperation, about developing societies, for example, in a way that trade agreements between countries can be more equitable. It's a documented fact that despite of developmental aid and despite of the amount of money that, for example, refugees are sending to their origin countries, more capital is flowing from poorer countries to wealthier countries than going the other way because of inequitable trade treaties, inequitable finance arrangements, and so on. So combating hunger, combating population growth, and combating poverty are not possible without also engaging the citizenships in wealthier countries. And to end this lecture part on a more positive note, if a country succeeds in ending or stabilizing the population development, so if a country has a quickly, rapidly growing population, the demographic will look like a pyramid. You will have a lot of young people, a lot of dependents, a lot of people to take care of. It's very hard to get out of poverty. It's very hard to get out of hunger if you have a huge number of children. So in this situation, people will need active help in getting out of the dire situations. But when population growth is going down, when you are going to that stabilization phase, this thick part will raise higher. You will have what is called a youth bulge. This is where people start sniggering and making naughty jokes in the back of the class usually. Youth bulge means that you have a proportionally large amount of people who are in the age of employment, people who are in the most creative, active parts of their life. And the youth bulge can create, in the best of circumstances, what's called a demographic dividend, that the society gets an influx of energy and creativity at the precise moment when they are just trying to get on a better track. But the youth bulge can also become a youth bomb if you don't have employment, if you don't have social security, if you don't have democratic institutions, then the youth bulge can become a breeding ground for discontent and terrorism and so on. So again, even when things start to go better way, you will still need a coordinated effort to push the society on a better developmental path. So in a nutshell, even though it seems that we need more food, even though it seems that we're gonna get more people in the world anyway, but the number of that increase depends on the development. And even though climate change is a serious threat to these endeavors, the situation is not hopeless if we can devise policies that tackle all these dimensions of poverty, population, and hunger at the same time. Well, we will need also better environmental policies, because if climate change goes over certain critical borderlines, then this kind of development won't be possible in many African countries or even in Italy or Spain because, well, producing food may grow to be impossible. But if environmental policies are even somewhat successful, then we can still continue to combat hunger and combat poverty in a more hard world of climate change. Thank you. So that's the lecture. So we have, what, half an hour-ish for discussion.
I had.
Yeah.
I would like to ask your opinion about the GMO plants or animals or
Yeah.
are you for or against?
Well, the question was, I'll repeat if the mic doesn't take it. So what's my opinion on GMO technology in agriculture, for example? I'll answer that by answering the question of technology more generally. So what is the role of technology in solving these issues? Well, if we look at agriculture and food production historically, we have always had technological advances. For example, windmills. In the sort of deep, dark ages of the Middle Ages, actually the technology of windmills was highly, highly sophisticated, and it progressed very, very high. So we had sort of a mini industrial revolution during the Middle Ages regarding windmills and water mills. And one of the key breakthroughs in agricultural technology that has been actually devised, I think, many times around the world, is that when you plant alternate planting of cereal crops and legumes like beans or peas, you will get better crops because the legumes actually add the nitrogen from the atmosphere to the soil, and the cereal crops can take advantage of the nitrogen. And other such biological technologies have been around for actually hundreds and hundreds of years. Adding animal manure or adding human manure has of course been a very common technology for millennia in agriculture. So in any way, of course, technology is crucial in agriculture or producing food, because when you take crops away from the soil, you're going to lose some nutrients. That's sort of self-evident. So you have to replenish nutrients. You're going to need energy, muscle energy or animal muscle energy or fossil fuel energy to gather your crops and process them and so on. So in sort of principle, GMO technologies in themselves are no different to that continuum. But the issue is whether you use the right kind of technologies for the right kinds of contexts. And that was the key problem with the so-called Green Revolution. Is this term familiar to you? Yeah. Green Revolution in the 60s, 70s, after the Second World War, basically was a change in the world food production system towards intensive use of herbicides, pesticides, and synthetic fertilizers, which did increase production in many situations because, well, you get a sudden influx of nutrients in your fields. You can combat pests or diseases for a while quite effectively. But as many people who do research on food security or food sovereignty have noted, Green Revolution benefited people who could afford the new chemicals, who could afford the huge monetary investments. But for people who couldn't afford them, the Green Revolution actually created poverty traps. So you had to compete with other farmers, you had to take the investments, but you couldn't really afford them, So you perpetuated your hunger and you perpetuated your poverty. And India has been a prime example of these kinds of problems. India produces more food than the population of the country needs, but it has a huge hunger problems. So the question is, what is actually the problem with in the food system, and what kinds of technologies can actually help to alleviate that? Use of fossil fuels clearly has been beneficial in production because you get more energy. You don't have to depend only on your muscles, or you don't have to have 10 children and 3 wives or whole extended family to tend to your crops. You can sort of get invisible slaves made out of oil, for example. But then, of course, climate change quite clearly makes kind of a problem with using those invisible slaves. With regards to the other technologies of green revolution, the increased use of synthetic fertilizers and pesticides has created problems with pollinators, for example. It's clearly a critical phase when insect populations in the world are plummeting in many areas. So even though it was effective from one viewpoint, it was at the same time eroding the sort of ecological foundation of production. And also soils around the world are eroding, especially in many poorer countries, due to the lack of improper food production methods. So technologies can be effective, but they can be extremely mal-effective or maladaptive from another viewpoint. So you need to evaluate these technologies from a generic viewpoint. And often the discussion around GMOs focuses just on the sort of muddy moral or religious kind of, is this natural or, yeah. Well, my PhD was about the concept of nature. So you can see, check my viewpoint on that there. But the discussion about the systemic implications of technologies, the dependencies that they create for people, that is, I think, the linchpin here. And actually, there seem to be a couple of questions. I'll make just one addition here, that one important technological direction that can be very successfully married to this food security approach is called agroecology. This is not organic farming. This is not some kind of return to traditional methods. This is actually a combination of newest ecological research, lessons learned from traditional methods, and so on. It's an amalgam of new and old that is based on the idea that by using the ecological potential of the food production area, by using the natural cycles of nutrients, for example, you can lessen your dependence on fertilizer inputs and chemical inputs. And what's more important regarding environmental issues, that agroecology is increasingly trying to combine together certain key issues like water, to farm with less reliance on artificial irrigation, nutrients, to get more nutrients to cycle in your food production system instead of adding more and having it leach out with the rains every year. Soil health is related to water and nutrient issues, but in a way to get the soil to be more stable in opposition to constant erosion, which is a huge problem in the world. And fourth issue, which is quite recent but is potentially huge, is coal sequestration or carbon sequestration, which means that by adding organic matter to the soils and mixing it with the soils by various methods, favoring that kind of plants that keep the soil more whole instead of erosion, by using plants with deeper roots, for example, you can sequester or inject sort of carbon from the atmosphere into the fields. Currently, most of the fields in the world emit carbon in the atmosphere, so they contribute to climate change. But this is a huge direction in climate research, is how to get the soils, the fields and farms of the world to become sinks of carbon instead of sources of carbon. And this is a much, much bigger thing to get this agroecological virtuous cycle going than just increasing the production of fields. Well, you're gonna increase production anyway with this. Actually, a colleague of mine is doing field work in the Horn of Africa where they inoculate fields with different kinds of natural bacteria to get the sort of natural processes going on again that have been destroyed by careless farming. That kind of technology can be a huge game changer, for example. But okay, we have a few questions. Why do we think that small-scale farmers would want to produce if they had choice or possibility to do something else? Well, yeah, that is actually a very good question. Often small-scale farming or subsistence farming, where you grow food for your family, that is romanticized. That is seen that is the ideal lifestyle that we have lost, and we have, remnants of it in Finnish novels like Täällä Pohjolan tähden alla or something like that. You cannot make small-scale farming sustainable if you don't have also the wider, more equitable social development where you have schools in the countryside, where you have hospitals in the countryside, where you have, for example, communication networks where people can partake in the society, even if they live in the hinterlands. So maintaining or reproducing a livable countryside is a necessary complement to this. And urbanization is seen as the big mega trend in the world, and it will be a mega trend because it's already going on in a world where population is growing and will keep growing for some time at least. But it's not necessary, it's not inevitable to urbanization to be uncontrollable. Because if you have uncontrollable population growth and uncontrollable migration to the cities, then the infrastructure of the cities, both political, social and physical infrastructure of the cities, will not be able to keep up. You have huge number of people chasing after their dreams in the big cities, but when they get there, they don't have the, suitable or stable living conditions. They don't have the possibilities of employment and safe life or education, which will lead to migration, and sort of the domino will go on. So it's always, again, an issue of democratic and equitable development. How many small-scale farmers we would need for every 1,000 citizens in different areas of the world? I don't have that kind of calculator in my head. But well, the basic answer is that in many countries where there is hunger, there's already sufficient food production. That is not the case everywhere. In some countries where, for example, population is growing fast and the countrysides have been eroded, there is actually an acute problem with the availability of food, which was the first pillar of food security. But like in countries like India, small-scale farmers are currently producing enough. So this is not a utopia. It is not an issue that in some distant future day we might have small-scale farmers feeding the world. We have small-scale farmers already feeding the world, but the social arrangements of division of economy, division of education, division of opportunity, they are not equitable. So the food is not coming to the people who actually need it. And this is actually a problem in the United States. You have farmers who are chronically poor. You have farmers whose children are chronically malnourished. And there is actually an epidemic of farmer suicides going on, not only in India, but also in the United States. Yeah, some more questions. Yeah.
I was wondering this when you talked about this GMO
Yeah.
GMO thing,
Yeah.
and you said that we need to consider carefully the problem and how to solve it, and what do the technologies do with it, or do they make it worse or that? So how do you see this this kind of decision making and capitalism? Like, do you see that this is possible in these capitalistic systems, or do we need like some other systems that we could?
Yeah. Okay, so the basic question is this doable in capitalism?
Yes.
This kind of virtuous circle development. Well, the key issue, I think, is, well, maybe someday people are going to devise large-scale new kinds of institutions, but the beginnings of change cannot happen if you don't have active democratic citizenships that are taking matters into their own hands, that are taking combating the power of the entrenched interest of the old food system. So it's not immediately the question of replacing capitalism. It's immediately the question of rejuvenating democracy. If the only notion of democracy is that you have to vote, and well, then the system takes care of itself, then you don't have real kind of democracy. So active citizenship, active citizens' mass movements, they are a counter force to the narrow viewpoints of economic concerns. The question of when capitalism stops being capitalism, that's a tricky one. I don't know if, in many countries in the 70s or 80s, when welfare state was being built and when the trade unions were quite powerful, what kind of capitalism it was. Then again, at that time there was the Cold War, which doesn't exist anymore. So the issue of transformation to a new kind of a system is a tricky one because it never happens overnight, even in revolutions. But the sort of prerequisite to change regarding these issues is definitely an active citizenship and the notion of international solidarity and the notion of international equity. But it's not just a question of helping other people. In the end, it's also a question of helping ourselves. Because if the food system, say in all of the Middle East or Sub-Saharan Africa, begins to erode in the coming decades with climate change, if it's not being reacted to by sensible social development, then you're gonna have a uncontrollable mass migration of hundreds of millions of people. And that will sort of create a shock around the whole of the world, and I can't see current social systems coping with that. So getting truly socially and ecologically sustainable local development going on in the vulnerable parts of the world is the only way to safeguard the world from severe uncontrollable systemic changes. And that's fundamentally a question of democracy and equity. No questions from the rest of the world.
Uh,
Are you guys out there? Are you awake? But was
I have-
2:30 what?
Okay, I just had
Yeah.
a small question about the World Bank and you just mentioned
Yeah.
that they have this. You remember?
Yeah, the poverty line
Yeah,
of 1.9.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Could you open that a bit?
Yeah, the previous poverty line by the World Bank was, if I remember correctly, was $1.25, and a few years ago it was updated to $1.9. To take account of the changing purchasing power, changes with prices of commodities and so on. But for example, India, if you use the World Bank definition of 1.9, the percentage of poverty in the country is 12.4%. But if you use the definition of the Indian government, which is 2 point something dollars per day, I think, then you have circa 25% of poverty in the world. World Bank and the IMF have been slightly becoming more sensible in the recent years, but still they basically found their policies in the notion that per capita income and gross national product, GDP or BKT as we say in Finland, those are the two measuring devices of the country's development. And that is, well, it's basically just to do with certain entrenched disciplines in economic policy and economic science, which have sort of pervaded these institutions, and it's very, very hard to change them, even though there is a growing amount of research against that grain, even in those institutions themselves. But the basic question, I think, is that it's easier to make policy if you have one measure that seems to be objective. It's very, very hard to make policy when you have to dig deeper down to the local level, of the regional level, of the country level. Because the devil is in the details, but it's very hard to make policy with devil. Are we running out of time? Or, but I'm in no hurry if anybody has some questions.
Mielestäni.
10 minuuttia vielä.
Okay, we have 10 minutes, yeah. Oh yes, I've been away from the university so long. I forget the regular schedule.
Well,
Yeah.
when you talked about these four like different parts of the to decrease the population growth,
Yep.
like the women's rights, education, and incomes and food security, and that they should be like thought as a whole, like
Yes.
nine. So how can we do this? Do you have any ideas about that?
Yeah. Well, yeah. Education is often seen as the silver bullet when people are talking about population growth in public. Either you have the usually old angry men who are saying that, oh, those people over there, they're just reproducing like rabbits. We can't do anything. I get that all the time when I'm lecturing. But that's an avoidable part, I guess, of growing old for some people. But then the other answer is, but isn't education the answer? It is the answer, but it is not the answer alone. especially in many African countries, there's been a lot of literature about education gap, which means that on paper you seem to have educational institutions going on. But for example, if the households don't have enough energy, there is no daylight, so children can't read. This is actually a real life problem in some Indian locales, for example. And there's an Indian researcher who got the inspiration in Finland for developing a new kind of a low energy reading light. So it can be, down to these everyday minutiae. But another thing is, for example, that if the family doesn't have enough money, the children have to drop out of school and go to work. So even the enrollment numbers of schools may be much higher than the graduation numbers. Or, for example, are the teachers educated properly? That can be a big problem. So you may have 40 children trying to learn something, and you have, unprofessional teachers and outdated textbooks, dated textbooks, and so on. So really, the only way to foster proper education is to combine education campaigns with other campaigns. So, well, it's not an easy thing to do, but the first answer is to get away from narrow developmental programs into more widespread programs. An author called Ben Ramalingam in his book Aid on the Edge of Chaos, he has been researching the way that developmental programs have been going around the world, how they have failed and how they have succeeded. And one constant point of failure is the pressure to report the results of the developmental program. So if you have an educational program, you have to report graduations, you have to report enrollment figures as fast as you can to get money for the next program. And that tends to create sort of paper tiger developmental problems that have, on paper, they have strengths, but in reality they are weak. And with Ben Ramalingam, his basic advice is let things fail. Don't try to control development, but try to give the local people the possibilities to take initiative in development programs, create them as more cooperative and learning enterprises instead of trying to cookie cut the same solution around the world. Cookie cut is in Finnish piparilleikkuri. So you have the same shape of things that you try to apply to all the locales of the world. So by necessity, there is not a good general answer to the issue. So the only general answer is this context, sensitivity, and the possibility of local people to get take part in the developmental process and to take initiative to be part of it, to be empowered in it, and not just recipients of aid. There's one thing I should mention. I mentioned small-scale fishermen, or small-scale fishermen and fisherwomen. And this is actually an issue where changing policies in wealthier countries can create quick results. There's been a lot of discussion going around for so-called bilateral fishing treaties. Which means basically, for example, that EU or an EU country makes a treaty with, say, Senegal, that, say, Spanish fish trawlers can go to the coastline, the exclusive economic zone, which is the, the coastal zone where only Senegal can fish. So the Spanish trawlers can go there, they fish, and then they pay to the Senegal government. Okay, we get the fish, you get the money. This is quite equitable. On paper, again, you get fair exchange. But what happens is that earlier you had these ripples in a pond. You had the fisher and the fish going to the market, to the smokers, to the cooks, to the sellers, and so on. You had a whole developmental process going around the one key employment, the one key vocation. But when this is replaced or basically destroyed by the foreign fishing, you start to lose other parts of employment. You get lessened food security, you get lessened women's empowerment or possibilities of women's empowerment, and as a documented result, you get mass emigration to Spain, for example. A friend of mine who's a journalist did many reportages about Senegalese fisher people moving to Europe basically just because of these bilateral fishing treaties. But EU stopped these fishing treaties for a while, but unfortunately, the last I heard, they're coming back. But the onset of these treaties created this destruction in a very simplistic causal way. You had a very complex local economy which is washed away by just creating these new kind of treaties. And stopping these treaties is a prerequisite for rejuvenating this local economy. And there's another result of this. Small-scale fishing in a country like this is connected also to the practice that fish is consumed wholesale. I mean, people are using the heads and the tails and the bones and the skins even to eat them for jewelry making, for fertilizers and so on. Where my wife comes from, Finnish country, fishing village near Pori, and they eat the fish, the heads of the fish and the bones of the fish. So it's not exotic. Every poor fisherman around the world has done it throughout the history. But this sort of complex consumption of fish, which is highly nutritious, is then replaced by imported fillets of fish, which only has protein basically, only has certain fatty acids and so on. But it will create undernutrition, even though on paper you have people getting enough calories and getting enough protein. So it's a question of at the same time creating the biological problem of hunger in a multidimensional way, but at the same time creating multidimensional social problems. And these bilateral fishing treaties are a prime example of political action in Western countries. If EU citizens combat these treaties, then you can get results very quickly. Of course, this economy has been already destroyed. Then you're going to need concerted action to try to rejuvenate it, and that's of course hard. Yeah, thanks. This was nice. Thank you. Hey, and thank you guys. I was watching your play.
Which one?
King Ubo. Oh. It was wonderful. Thank you. Thank you.
Kiitos.